I do not support the basic income grant.
I fully support it, mainly because it will improve the standard of living for ordinary citizens.
My take on the topic is that it does make one to relax, and it also makes you not to look for a job.
The wealth of the country and the economy of the country belongs to all South Africans. Now, a system that excludes some people, it's a crime against the Constitution and crime against humanity.
Hello and welcome to a brand new season of the Big Debate. I'm Ridi Tlhabi. Fighting for change, a better life for all, a people's contract to create work and fight poverty. Together we can do more. Do these ring a bell? They are all ANC election slogans, and yet despite the promises, we live in a country where 1 in 5 South Africans are living in extreme poverty. The ANC government says its main strategy to reduce poverty is job creation, and yet 1 in 3 South Africans are jobless, and the rate is rising. Many middle and upper income countries pay income guarantees to their most vulnerable citizens. In Britain, for example, there's the dole. In Brazil, it's called the Bolsa Familia. And in Spain, the minimum vital income grant was introduced as a response to the pandemic. And in 2021, it was made permanent. In South Africa, it would be called the Basic Income Grant, or BIG. Except the ANC government says we can't afford it. Finance ministers from Manuel to Mboweni and now the new keeper of the public purse, Enoch Godongwana, are worried about another dragon lurking in the shadows: dependency. If you pay grants to poor people so they can buy food and fuel, you'll make them lazy. To guard against that evil, the argument goes we shouldn't pay a basic income grant even if we had the money. During COVID-19, the government was forced to pay a teeny-weeny basic income grant. The social relief of distressed grant was only 350 rand, and even then, not everybody was eligible. Even after the intervention, people remain hungry and angry. On this episode of our new virtual season of the Big Debate, we ask if it's time for a proper, full-sized basic income grant that provides enough money to eat, clothe your family, and provide adequate shelter. Now, from wherever you are joining us today in South Africa, hello to you and welcome. And we've got our audience members who have made time for us on our first episode. I'm delighted to see you in the Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, Gauteng. Hello, everyone. Wave at me if you can hear me. So, guys, before we get going with our discussion today, I have a question for you, our audience members. Wave at me if you are in favor of the basic income grant. If you think the time is now and we need it, just wave at me. There we go. A couple of hands up. Okay, now my next question. Those of you who say, you are not in favor of the basic income grant, just wave at me. You're not in favor of it. I can't wait to hear why. And I'm going to interact with you live on the show later on. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. So during the show, we are also going to talk to the government, business and communities. But before we get into it, let's just listen to Minister Lindiwe Zulu talking about social grants. Here's what she had to say.
We brought back the basic income grant discussion and debate on the table on the basis that we were saying, yes, 350, then what afterwards?
Okay, so Minister Zulu also said that these new grants should be made permanent and that the ANC government is looking at a basic income grant. My first guest today is Brenton van Vrede, Chief Director of Social Assistance at the Department of Social Development. Brenton, COVID relief grant, social grants. We have all these grants. Why throw money at social security?
Thanks, Ridi, and thanks for giving us an opportunity to speak on your show. The first point where we have to start off is that, as a country, we have a constitution where social security is a right. It does allow for progressive realization. And over the last 2.5 decades or so, we have progressively realized a portion of that right to access social security and social assistance. But we've only reached about 40% of our population. We still got a large portion of our population, which is largely those between the ages of 18 and 60, who don't necessarily have access to this right to social assistance as per our constitution. The grants we've already implemented has had a massive impact on poverty and inequality. And we believe that, if we provide access to the whole population to some form of social assistance when they need it, we can actually begin to make a huge dent in poverty and inequality. There's about 10 million people in the country that is experiencing hunger on a weekly basis. And I think any government cannot tolerate, this levels of inequality, poverty, and even hunger for any extensive period of time.
I'll challenge you on that the government cannot tolerate these levels of hunger, because this basic income grant conversation has been going on for 20 years, but we'll get back to that in just a moment. Are you promising something that you cannot deliver? The fact of the matter is that just a few days ago, Treasury came out and saying that you are talking about something aspirational, that our aspirations must be measured up against what is economically possible. The DG of Treasury also followed up, basically saying that we can't afford it. How are you going to get this past Treasury, may I ask?
I think we probably in the position to do that.
Well, Brenton, I do love your optimism, and I hope that you are right. But I must say, I think you are downplaying the tensions and the disagreements between social development and Treasury. But we'll continue to watch this particular space. Right now, we want to bring in the voice of business. We are expecting a basic income grant. We don't know when. In a moment, we will talk to community activists and grant recipients. But first, I do want to hear the voice of business. Stay with us. Don't go away.
In Alex, young people like Andile Mthethwa do their best to survive despite not having access to grants.
Ngiqale ukusebenza econtainini February 2021 for part-time until I get a job. Ngidayisa ama-parts emoto, ama-second hand, ama-oil, ama-cold drinks. Okay, yona income lapha econtainini ngiyayithola. Yeah, but not that much amount abo expecta empilweni, but yona iyangipusha cause even ngikhipha nanasestradini i-COVID relief grant ngayi-applyela yathi ngena yaqala yanga-approve, but by June or May between lapho ila yaqala ya-approve khona angilandanga the whole year. But ngo-December, kwathi ngilanda ngo-December, ngalanda i-1.4. And leyo 1.4 leyo, ingisize into nini. Ngwazile ukuthenga impahla, ngwazile ukuthenga ukudla endlini, ngabasherela. Kwaba another thing, yabo, sajabula ukuthi okay, there's something nami engitholile, yabo.
Welcome back to the big debate. I just want to hear the voice of business now. It's a pleasure to welcome Mamukiti Dijani, fixed income strategist at ABSA. Mamukiti, so on the basic income grant itself, I mean, what are your thoughts?
So my thoughts are, that a basic income grant as a basic principle where every single individual in an economy gets a transfer for South Africa, even globally, is a little bit of a problematic idea. And then, when it comes to grants that are relief for social pressures, which are the ones that you sort of like mentioned earlier, like the Bolsa Familia, etc., I don't think there's a debate around that. And then there's obviously, as far as South Africa is concerned, there's the issue of affordability, which is one that you've already highlighted.
Why is it problematic? What do you mean that it would be problematic?
So if you look at South Africa, you can argue that you do have a structural unemployment problem that you need to address. But the question is that unemployment by design, or is it a function of something you cannot change? Plus, this economy is not big enough to generate the kind of surpluses that are going to be there to provide an income for everybody.
Okay, so it sounds as if you're suggesting jobs rather than grants. But how do we, in the South African context, tell people to look for jobs that are not there? The unemployment figures came out a couple of weeks ago, and they are just jaw-dropping at over 34%, but using the expanded definition, over 40%. Jobs, not grants, are they two mutually exclusive?
So that's not in any way, shape, or form what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is, if you don't have enough productivity so that your GDP is not big enough, your tax revenue is not big enough, you're not going to be able to afford a basic income grant anyway, which is where we are, right? So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, this jobs versus grants discussion. It's also like, it's a little bit muddied as well. It's like this highly emotive thing that's been created by how we're talking about this. What we need to accept is that the reason we have the jobs numbers that we have is by design. There are things we can do about that. So you don't have a debate jobs versus grants. You only have jobs. You can't afford
But aren't those long-term plans? I mean, immediately, how do we tackle the hunger problem? And I want to put something else on the table. I mean, countries like Namibia and Kenya, they did a pilot project on the grants, and it was found that grants were effective in reducing malnutrition, poverty, hunger, and the health outcomes were better. And in other parts of the world, mind you, school attendance increased as a result of the grant. So surely we must see it as an investment in people rather than just expenditure.
Really, you're talking like South Africa doesn't have a grant system that is quite extensive already. So all those studies that you're talking about, those outcomes that you're talking about are already evident in our system as well. If you look at how we've moved in terms of expanding the grant recipients, etc., and the positive outcomes that we've seen as a result, they're already evident in this country. So this is nothing new, right? So what you then have to figure out is how much more grants can you extend while remaining affordable? Because there's no point making a big grant story right now and moving a grant support so high that it becomes unaffordable, because it'll topple growth and you enter into this vicious cycle where actually the more you spend on grants, the less you can afford over the long term. So, you can't divorce yourself from that reality, right? So now the question is, what is it that you can afford? I'm a proponent of an approach where you increase the grant, but together with that, you introduce job-supporting reforms that will then help you fund the grant.
But so Mamkete, I mean, do you understand, though, that in the context of South Africa, with this mammoth corruption problem that we're facing, we've lost trillions through corruption. We hear about that all the time at the Zondo Commission as well. It's very difficult for us South Africans to buy the argument that we can't afford grants when we're losing trillions through corruption. Isn't it a case of using our money better in order to avail money for a new grant or an expanded grant?
So if there are pots of liquidity somewhere that you can access, like if you close the taps on corruption and that money becomes available, the math changes, right? But the reality right now is that you don't have the money. So go find the money. And then if you find it, then spend it. But you can't spend money you don't have.
So, Mamkete, what I heard from you loudly and clearly was that at this moment, we can't afford it. Make the money available, find it first, then we can talk basic income grant. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Thanks indeed. So a basic income grant could relieve hunger and poverty. Those in the government who control the money say we can't afford it. What do you think? Shortly, we'll hear from community leaders. Don't go away.
I'm one of the social grant beneficiaries, and my take on the topic is that it does make one to relax, and it also makes you not to look for a job because you know there's an income coming in every month.
Unemployment rate is very high in South Africa. With the grant, people will be able to buy their basic necessities, apply for different skilling programs, start their businesses, and in return, that will give them skills that will provide an income for them in the long run, and they'll contribute to the development of our economy, and they won't depend on the grant.
It also puts us in a very catch-22 position, because it's either going to create an active contributing citizen back to society where those who are receiving the grant are going to get on their feet and be able to bring change and help others, or it's going to put the receiver in a comfort zone.
Okay, so those are some of the opinions from South Africans. Welcome back to the Big Debate. We are talking about the basic income grant. In case you missed it, that's cash paid monthly to everyone in South Africa who needs it. Enough to buy food, pay rent, get some airtime, clothes, fuel. Are you looking forward to your grants? Don't count your chickens before they hatch. We don't have it yet. We don't have a basic income grant. Our finance ministers have said grants can create dependency. They can make people lazy, and then they stop looking for jobs. And in fact, one of the WhatsApp clips that we played for you earlier was a young person saying exactly that. So, as you just heard, not everyone agrees with that particular viewpoint. Now, let's talk to three of the smartest social and economic thinkers in the country. Duma Gubule from the Center of Economic Development and Transformation. We also have Mpho Mhlongo of the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. Lebo Ramofoko, CEO of Atlantic Fellows for Health Equity, South Africa based at Tekano. She has been part of civil society call for a basic income grant for the last 2 decades. So it's a pleasure to have you with us. Let's start with you, Lebu. Waudra, they say dependency. People are just going to become lazy. We can't afford it. We already have grants.
Ridi, I just want us to do an experiment. Let's give every minister 350 or even 500 rands to be more generous. And let them stay at home and let us see how lazy that they will become. That is an absurd argument. It is anti-poor. It is also violent because if you look at the statistics on poverty, it is Black women in the main that basically are at the bottom of this economy. And the Black women contribute what is called unpaid labor or unrecognized labor. They clean our kitchens and the kitchens of ministers. They are bringing up 60% of the children in South Africa who, despite a maintenance act, cannot access that act because we've got a country that does not implement its own laws. We are talking about people who have been excluded from the economy. We cannot adopt an argument that is ahistorical. And the one myth that I want to bust is the fact that apartheid has ended. Because apartheid was not only about who was in power, but it was enforced by systems and institutions. To give you an example, the poor spend, and they are mainly Black, due to spatial planning, they spend proportionally higher of their income on public transport than any other group. If you are living outside of where the major centers of economy are, the bulk of the money that you earn goes on public transport. Even those who propose, as Professor Friedman put it, that they are fighting for radical economic transformation, they are not talking about an economy that is going to allow the majority to enjoy it. They are going to be basically allowing a few, like we have seen with all other forms of relief that have been here, where it is the few that are connected that then sit at the table. We want a table that is dismantled.
Right.
When we advocated for the basic income grant almost 20 years ago, and I'm happy that Duma is here, we then looked at the economy and how you can structure the economy. And even back then, you could basically afford it.
Let's talk about affordability with Duma. Duma, let me bring you in here. I saw you nodding when Lebu was speaking. We've heard from economists, various finance ministers are saying, hey, asnamali, we don't have money. Affordability is an issue. You dispute that. Why?
Now, in terms of the affordability, I've read about 15 studies that explain in detail. They've all come out in the past year how it can be paid for. Some of them involve different types of taxes, which I won't go into, also taxing the rich people. But at the same time, my view is that what South Africans need to understand, and the previous speaker from business, is that a national budget does not operate like a household budget or a company budget. When the people spend the money, a lot of the money comes back to the government as taxes. So, for example, you spend the money into the community, 15 or 13% comes back as VAT. People who are employed pay back some of the benefit back to the tax system. And on top of that, there are multiplier effects in terms of how much it stimulates. It's a catalytic force for development in local communities. There have been case studies, you talked about Kenya. There was a basic income grant pilot in Kenya where they paid $1,000 to 10,000 households. And the multiplier effect from that basic income grant, every dollar that was spent, 2.5 for the economy. So that meant in addition to the beneficiaries who got $1, and 1.5 went to people who were not beneficiaries of the grant, right. Shopkeepers, local businesses in the community. And the same thing was done in Ethiopia in the Tigray province before the war that broke out. There was a pilot. It also came to the same conclusion that it creates multiply effects. Now, if you take into account the VAT, you also take into account the income tax that will be paid, and you take into account multipliers. Right. So the net cost is much less than the gross cost. I believe it's less than 50%.
So, Mpho, is that it now? We show it's a lack of imagination in South Africa. We're not framing this debate properly. We're looking at basic income grant as expenditure, money that we're going to lose, rather than investment in our people, investment that has positive economic outcomes for the entire country. Your thoughts?
I absolutely agree with you that there's a misconception that with providing grants, it's just money that's going out. But no one is really thinking about the fact that money will be coming in with increased buying powers from millions of people that will go to the VAT, and people will be encouraged to find more higher earning jobs, actually, and by that virtue pay more tax.
Mm-hmm. And Lebo, let me bring you in here. You know, also the way we talk about the poor in South Africa is, for me, quite disturbing. The binaries of us and them, they will be lazy, they will be dependent, they'll stop looking for jobs. That's problematic for me.
We speak about them like that until we need their votes. Then we are in the communities with T-shirts and some food parcels because we know what a power they are. And if you think about the fact that the majority of registered voters are Black women, then we don't want to basically legalize prostitution, but we want to use Black women because Black women must vote for us. Black women must also be silent when you are calling them lazy. Black women are pathologized because this poverty on the whole has a face. And the face is a Black child. The face is a Black woman. And for me, the only argument I can make is that this government is anti-poor and anti-Black women who are mainly heading these households. Let us talk about what we see communities do with the grants that they have. They are able to get into public transport to go and seek employment. They are able to get data, which is still exorbitantly high in South Africa, to send that CV. They are able, women are able to take children into childcare centers where the government fails to actually have a proper system of early childhood development. They are able to bring their money together and even provide for each other a safety net that the government itself has failed to provide. And when the speaker from business spoke and said, you know, you must have measures that support employment, what he says is that do not give that money to the poor, but give it to business in the form of tax breaks so that they can give, they can create employment. And we have seen that the beneficiaries of even our democracy are people who have had the means. They are mainly white people. You need to be in Cape Town and any major city to see that the rich have indeed gotten richer in South Africa.
Let me bring you in there, Duma. I also want you to address what our representative from business had to say, Mamukiti. She said that we are talking as if there are no grants in South Africa. We already have various grants. Those were her arguments.
Okay, yeah, that's the other issue I wanted to address because that is so. What we have is a grant for people who are too old to work, and let me just make this is the old age grant. The old age grant was there under apartheid as well. And now the second thing, we have a grant for people who are too young to work, the children. And the grant for the children is below the poverty line. So the demand from civil society is that the grant must be brought to the food poverty line and the 3 poverty lines. That's the second thing. What we don't have is a social security system, as you said at the beginning of this show, that caters for the working age population, as you have in other countries where There are people who are protected.
And I suppose for me as a South African, I would feel way better if they were doing other things like free education for vulnerable citizens, if they were providing other elements. Lebura Mufuko spoke about early childhood development and the interventions there. We remember during COVID-19 that we even had this debate as a country to continue the feeding scheme for pupils who now forfeited that meal because of the COVID lockdown. Why were we even debating that as a country? So for me as a citizen, if all those things were happening, I'd feel a little better about this whole basic income grant and dependency conversation, because I'd say, hey, look, they're already doing A, B, C, D, and E, but they're not doing that, but they don't want to entertain a basic income grant. So anyway, have you made up your mind on whether a basic income grant is a handout or an investment? When we return, we hear from members of the community. Stay with us.
Nomtunzi Gufa, in Jegezi village in the Eastern Cape, struggles to make ends meet for her household, which survives on her old age grant and the child grant she collects for the children in her care.
Ilula yonke lento kum. Khonto enzima lento. Kuba xa ndifika ndivela epeyini. Ndifika le mali ndiyahlula apha phezu kwale bhidi. Ndivala umnyango. Ndiyibeke ngendawo zayo. Ndide ndibone uba ndiyashota apha egrosalini. Into nayo kuba kunyanzelekile uba ezi zinto ndizenze. Yimali zemibutho zilapha kum. Zinto zesikolo zilapha kule mali. Yonke into ijonge kule mali, into elapha kweli khaya ijonge kule mali. Ngoba andithethi ngaleyo mfana esisibonelelo se-COVID se-350, kuba kaloku yona kwa ubheke edolophini uyithatha imali leyo.
Welcome back to the big debate. We've got our audience with us. What are your thoughts on the basic income grant? What do you think?
It's going to create a chaos. Let me tell you something. Our youth of today, they are no longer looking for something that they are going to build their future, but they are based on partying, having fun, and it ends there. So I believe that if they give them that such amount, I'm telling you, the future of tomorrow is going to be lost.
With the argument for the basic income grant, I fully support it, mainly because it will improve the standard of living for ordinary citizens and the marginalized, and it will also reduce poverty levels and shift South Africa to a more equitable society. The only concern I have, however, is that it will not address the structural issues such as unemployment, the land issue, and education.
I support the COVID-19 grant, but I do not support the basic income grant. I think the COVID-19 grant is good for now during the pandemic, but in the long run, we need jobs as the youth. Because if you are going to give everyone a grant, that means the working class will have to pay more taxes. So no one is willing to pay more taxes because we're already paying a lot.
You can afford the grant right now if you just shift the spending priorities towards people instead of towards old historical priorities. Good is completely behind the basic income grant. We've been campaigning for it since we started, and our Minister DeLille has been campaigning for decades for it as well. It's completely affordable. Right now, it's just about reprioritizing existing spending patterns. If you asked each of the 700 state-owned enterprises to save 40 million rand a year each, we can afford at least a small basic income grant to start. If we could stop corruption, which is costing about 50 billion rand a year during the Zuma administration, that again can continue the COVID social distress grant on a permanent basis. If you looked for longer-term savings, cutting government down, cutting bloated salaries, then you can expand the grant even further to more people and to a larger amount every month.
This government doesn't have the political will to implement basic income grant because we thought the 350 will be a step towards basic income grant, but they don't have the willingness as the government. They give us the 350 again because it is for electioneering for next year elections. And then there is an austerity that this government is implementing. That is a war against the poor working class and the workers. And then thirdly, we are fighting and demanding basic income grant of 1,500 because it will generate the buying power of the 11 million people who are unemployed, who are poor in this country. And then we are sitting on a crisis, and this crisis is a time bomb.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kokoma Mutsi.
The extent of hunger and starvation and deprivation in communities is overwhelming. The food and access to water is a basic human need without which none of us can live. So it has to be a starting point in any budgeting process that a government takes care of the very most basic needs first. So if we're talking about affordability, I would say that we restructure our budget and make provision for people to have access to a basic income guarantee or a basic income grant.
Andile, you've heard arguments for and a picture painted of desperate poverty. It still doesn't move you?
No, I'm not changing my mind. I still think they still need to show us where this money is going to come from. Restructuring our budget, I don't think it's going to solve anything because it means there are other things that we as the country, we won't be able to do. The government needs to create more jobs for the people. That's all.
Daddy, I see on your strip there it says pay the grants. So you obviously don't agree with Andile Bonkle on this one. What are your thoughts, Daddy?
Unemployment has been on the rise from 1970s during the apartheid years. Now we are on the fourth industrial revolution. There is no way the government can create enough jobs for everybody. That they must just forget. Mm-hmm. Now, the preamble of the country says, South Africa belongs to all who live in it. It is only logical that the wealth of the country and the economy of the country belongs to all South Africans. Now, a system that excludes some people, it's a crime against the Constitution and crime against humanity.
2 points which the South African Federation of Trade Unions would like to register. Firstly, the major issue here from various contributors, including the first two speakers, one from government and the other from ABSA, highlighted the question of unaffordability. And what Duma tried to show them, which I think our friend there also does not even understand, is that the country like ours, where we have our own sovereign currency, we cannot spend like a household. By that we mean that because we are currency issuers, we do not need to borrow or tax before we spend, but we can spend before we even borrow and tax. We don't have to find money. Our Reserve Bank can fund this through.
Before you carry on, Trevor, you mentioned the Reserve Bank. What are you suggesting there? That they must print more money? They must. Let me be sure I hear you.
Yes, they must spend their way out of this because they can. There is no deficit that will hinder us in any way, especially because we, for instance, the current deficit or the current debt of the country, 10% of it is only denominated in foreign currency, and 90% of that is in the South African rand, which means we will not be able to default because we are the people who are printing the very same rand. We are the very issuers of the same rand. We have a sovereign currency. We have a reserve bank that can spend through, and of course, finance the treasury and all other basic services which our people are looking for.
All right, Trevor, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Who disagrees with Trevor? He said some very controversial comments as well. And somebody, okay, I see you, Claudel.
Trevor mentioning that the Reserve Bank can come in. No, the Reserve Bank has a framework that it can't just directly impact whether on unemployment or anything. So it has a limit to what extent it can do. And it hasn't exactly yielded good outcomes for countries that have opted to print more money. So also with the point regarding to if this were to happen, income increases in taxes would be yielded. I would say that we could, instead of using regressive taxes system within the country, we could go for progressive systems. How about we introduce the world tax? How about we introduce carbon tax emissions? So there are a lot of sources that we can get to finance the basic income grant thing.
The main issue about the South African Reserve Bank is that, one, the South African government only administrates. They do not control and they do not own that South African Reserve Bank. That is the main issue, apart from all the other things that have been raised. Now, coming back to the topic, one, this BIG is basically affordable, but it has to be only for a certain period of time. They'd have to come up with a strategy and then say, maybe for the next 10 years, this is what would stand, the BIG would stand. Instead of creating jobs, the government should actually create a space that will enable people to get jobs. So what do? Invest more money in people who are entrepreneurs so that they can make more money, be able to grow their companies to a point whereby they are able to hire more people. So what we can do is the BIG can stand for a certain period of time, but once you get access to certain opportunities, whether you get employed, and then you need to be phased out until everything is done with, and then we have a developed economy in our state.
Trevor, I'd like to get your response to all of that. I think the debate around the Reserve Bank, let's not go there. Maybe it's another topic for the big debate to go into another day. But this is a suggestion. Limited time, solve the problem, help people who are desperately poor, while at the same time stimulating entrepreneurship, economic growth, and don't leave people in the system forever. Is that acceptable, reasonable middle ground for you?
Yes, government must actually help these young entrepreneurs to be able to expand their production and hire more people in order to create more jobs. But the question is, where will government again get the money to go and support these small entrepreneurs? And this is where it actually comes back again to its expenditure abilities to be able to pump money in a manner in which is guided to ensure that small businesses are supported and they expand their production and hire as many people as possible. And maybe one last swipe at the person from ABSA. That person referred to the creation of jobs as if it's just something that government will tomorrow call it. But we know as a matter of fact that in the very last second term of this year, it is the finance sector which actually shed 280,000 jobs. And out of that, between 2017 and 2020, it was ABSA that shed jobs or retrenched as much as 3,270,000 workers there. We know that the rationalization in the finance industry has actually led to more job losses than ever. And the continued digitalization of that particular industry will continue to lead to shedding of jobs. So in this instance, indeed, you need to have money that is given to these people.
Let's wrap it up there. But I suspect we're going to return to this issue because they are all connected, all intersectional. If we don't have economic growth, if we don't have employment, you have more people needing the state to protect them. Thank you so very much for sharing your thoughts there. Very interesting, and for making time for us on our virtual big debate. I think the people have spoken. Will the government finally heed their calls? Coming up, we'll look at the next step, what urgent reforms are needed for our social security policy to ensure that no one lives in poverty.
Despite concerns that the basic income grant will cause dependency, many recipients of the 350 Social Relief of Distress grant want to work to improve their lives. And some, like Sibo Vilagazi, are budding entrepreneurs.
3 months ago, mina na my neighbors wami came up with an idea ukutala business yamagwinya ukuthi sizokhona ukupesha some stuff that we need. Yeah, and ngasho ukuthi right now business Pusha is isincedile. Yeah, and we truly appreciate the support esitholayo right now.
The basic income grant is an urgent intervention, but how much is enough?
I think 350 is not enough. I even feel like it's even better even if bangayenza ama coupon at least to 500.
As a country, we have a constitution where social security is a right.
we still got a large portion of our population, which is largely those between the ages of 18 and 60, who don't necessarily have access to this right to social assistance as per our constitution. The grants we've already implemented has had a massive impact on poverty and inequality. And we believe that, if we provide access to the whole population to some form of social assistance when they need it, we can actually begin to make a huge dent in poverty and inequality.
I think as South Africans, you look at what has happened around expenditure, you look at how much we've spent on, current expenditure, how much we've spent on capital. It's criminal. You look at what the state looks like, what the economy looks like, how people are closed out of economic activity. It's criminal. Go fix that. Generate the money, then spend it. You can't spend money you don't have. I'm a proponent of an approach where you increase the grant, but together with that, you introduce job-supporting reforms that will then help you fund the grant.
My view is that what South Africans need to understand is that a national budget does not operate like a household budget or a company budget. When the people spend the money, a lot of the money comes back to the government as taxes. And on top of that, there are multiplier effects in terms of how much it stimulates. It's a catalytic force for development in local communities. Right. So the net cost is much less than the gross cost. I believe it's less than 50%.
Okay, we've heard all these diverse views. We want to bring it all together and just craft the way forward. What happens next? And if we do have a basic income grant, how do we plan for it? How do we finance it? I'm going to bring in our closure, Busi Sibeko, who is from the Institute for Economic Justice, to join us on this conversation as we wrap it up. Busi, help us make sense of it.
No, thank you. And I've got the great task, really, of trying to summarize what has been said. I think to start off with my input is to say, to draw attention to the National Development Plan. And in Chapter 11 of the National Development Plan, the state has committed to, or is aspiring to, creating a social floor, a minimum social floor. And in talking about this minimum social floor, and I'll quote here, they say that we need to have an acceptable standard of living below which no one should fall over the entire life cycle. And it is important that we go back to this commitment, because we have to identify that the 18 and 59 group is a group that has not been able to access social protection adequately. And this is part of a developmental agenda. So we need to stop thinking of grants per se as just expenditure has already been, noted, but to think about grants in our economy as a way to increase economic participation. And just to re-emphasize what Duma has said, it's not 1 rand spent is 1 rand lost. That study in Kenya that he rightly points out, for 1 rand that they spent, they got 2.5 rand back. And so to think about basic income grants as a way of actually stimulating our economy and a way in which fiscal space, which is not a given, it's based on decisions that the state makes, can be expanded so that we can make other choices in the future and in the long run.
All right. And Lebu, you've heard it all. You've put your views on the table. How do we close this? What would you like to see?
So I think we've got to firstly shift the narrative amongst our population that believes the myth that social grants will lead to laziness, and that social grant and employment are basically mutually exclusive. In fact, social grants are going to enable young people, because I've heard young people speak, to even be able to buy data to look for a job. And we've got evidence of that, to get public transport money to go and look for a job, to start small businesses, as some of the examples that you have shown. The state has a moral duty to make sure that no child goes to bed hungry, no family basically has to ask themselves who is going to eat on that day. I think we've got a moral issue to think about who sits at the seat of the economy. And we are not going to win by having this very ahistorical understanding of the economy, that everything is equal for everybody. I mean, I look at young people, or some of the comments about the youth want to
drink and party,
create their own jobs. How do they create their own jobs in an economy that is so hostile to SMMEs. And I don't think paying a grant means that you don't solve that, but I think you need both.
One question before we really wrap up. I mean, where should the grant be set at? We spoke when we started the show, Lebu, we were very clear that 350 is not enough. You suggested we give that to all our ministers and see how they survive. So the basic income grant, what amount do you think is reasonable? Just very quickly, Lebu.
I think it should be an amount that will basically be around over 1,000. I think we need to basically have all the economists, brilliant economists like Duma, come on and look at what the state can rightfully spend. But it cannot be something that basically is as insulting as 350, as much as it is basically helping communities and families.
And Busi, your thoughts? I'm just curious to know, where should we set the basic income grant?
Yes, thank you for that. And I think certainly it has to be above the upper bound poverty line. And I'm just hearing these comments here to say that if we gave people who are not formally employed 1,268 Rand per month, it would actually cost us about 341 billion per year. And so we've put forward multiple ways in which this can be financed. And it doesn't necessarily have to come from middle income earners, as people like to expect, but to say that there's ways in which we can generate more tax revenue, in particular from our resource-intensive sectors, so that the wealth of the nation is redistributed to the people. But to say that, there's many ways to finance this. And again, I really agree that it's not about that we can't afford it. It's actually a decision to say we will afford it. That is the role of the state. The role of the state is to ensure social protection for its citizens. And therefore, the state must find a way to make sure that this happens.
Well, thank you so very much, both of you, Lebu and Busi, for also reminding us of the moral obligation, because I think sometimes we forget that the state does owe a duty to vulnerable members of our society, and that's perhaps where we should locate the conversation. The wonderful audience members, we didn't all agree. That's the point of the big debate. Thank you so much for staying with us on this virtual big debate. We really appreciate your insights and your inputs. Thanks indeed. So, this democracy is built on the promise that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. It's in our constitution. Our conversation today has shown that not everyone's life is an expression of this promise. We desperately need a basic income grant, just as desperately as we need jobs. We've also heard the numbers and that it would be an expensive exercise to implement a basic income grant. But the urgent question is, what is the cost if we don't? I'm Ridi Tlhabi, and you've been watching The Big Debate. Until next time.